This table looks perfectly fine in Excel. Then I press Ctrl P for print, and it comes out spread across 6 pages, with the last column stranded on a sheet of their own. So you click the obvious fix, which is to go into scaling and fit the sheet on one page. And now the text is so small it's barely worth printing. I know, Excel's print settings are a minefield and can be extremely frustrating, but give me 10 minutes to show you how to print any table properly, whether you're printing on paper or to a PDF. Plus, there's a free example file to download in the description and pinned comment. First, before we adjust margins, scaling, or page breaks, we need to tell Excel what size page we're actually designing for. You can do that on the Page Layout tab under the Size drop-down. You can see it's currently set to letter. I want A4, but if you're in the United States, then leave it on letter. Now this is a stock take sheet. Somebody has to carry it around a warehouse and write numbers on it by hand. So it has to be printed to paper and obviously be easy to read. Before we fix the width, let's click on the Page Break Preview button, which is down in the bottom right. And that shows us the separate pages that are going to be printed. But we need to deal with the mysterious blank pages because the cause explains a lot of Excel printing problems. When you haven't set a print area, Excel bases the page layout on what it considers the used part of the worksheet. And Excel's idea of used can include cells containing formatting even when they look completely empty. Now, a quick way to check is to press Ctrl End. And that takes you to Excel's last used cell. My actual table finishes in cell J27, but Excel has jumped all the way to cell V46. There's no visible data here, but this cell contains formatting, so Excel still considers it used. And this one stray cell has stretched the print range far beyond the real table, creating extra pages in the print range. Now, rather than letting Excel decide what belongs in the printout, you can select exactly what you want to print. So I want to print the table, and then on the Page Layout tab, under Print Area, set Print Area. Now Excel will only print this range. By the way, Excel defines the print area as a built-in name. And we can see it here in the Name Manager. And we're going to use that to create something much smarter later in the video, so stick around because you won't want to miss that. All right, so the blank pages have gone, but the last 2 columns are still on page 2. Let's just zoom in a bit. So before we scale anything, we can see the shape of the table is wider than it is tall. So portrait's not ideal. Back on the page layout, let's change the orientation to landscape. And with that, we can now safely print the stock sheet on one page. Let's look at the next scenario, printing long tables. This order log has 92 orders, and we can see if I Alt and down arrow, there are 4 depots, Bristol, Cardiff, Dundee and Leeds. Now to avoid any rogue cells distorting my print range, I'm going to select the actual table, including the header, and then set my print area. And because Excel stores print settings separately for each worksheet, I also need to make sure my paper size is correctly set to A4. Right, let's Ctrl P to see the print preview. As we scroll through the pages, we can see the last column for value is separated from the rest. It's only one column, so instead of changing the orientation to landscape, we can adjust the margins. And I like to do this by eye, by clicking on the margin icon in the very bottom right, and then left-clicking and dragging to reduce the margin size until my column appears. You can also adjust the column widths here using the pull handles. For example, I can make the quantity column narrower if need be. Just keep in mind that this will flow through to the sheet, adjusting the column there too. And of course, you can go into the margin settings here and choose from the built-in sizes or enter custom margins yourself. Just be careful because there's a lot of advice online telling you to set every margin to 0, but that can create problems because most office printers have an area near the edge of the paper that they can't print on. So even if Excel accepts zeros in here, the printer driver may override it, clipping content near the paper edge. Another safer option is under scaling. Selecting Fit All Columns on one page will force them to fit. So there you have a few options available for adjusting the margins or data to fit the page. Our data is now only 1 page wide, but as we scroll down, sheet 2 is missing the headings. We can repeat the column headings on each page, but we can't do it from the print preview. So let's go back to the worksheet and then on the Page Layout tab, print titles. And this opens the Page Setup dialog box on the Sheet tab. And under print titles, we've got rows to repeat at top. Just click on the row, it inserts the reference. And if you're printing data that spans pages horizontally, you can also choose columns to repeat on the left. All right, now let's go into print preview. And if I scroll down, we've got the column labels on both pages. Perfect. Now, while the report is readable, Excel is still choosing where each page ends based on the available space. It would be better if we had separate pages for each depot. But before we add our own page breaks, there's an important catch. Excel ignores manual page breaks if you have any of the Fit to scaling settings active. So if you've used that, instead, go into Custom Scaling and adjust the percentage size rather than using the Fit to options. All right, let's go back into Excel, into the page break preview, and here the blue line indicates my print range. And as I scroll down, the dashed blue line shows an automatic page break. Now I can left click and drag to move that page break. And now it's a manual page break as denoted by the solid blue line. But I need more. That's only for the first page. I need another page break after Leeds. So I'll select the first row containing Cardiff. And then under the breaks drop down, insert page break. Let's repeat for Dundee, selecting the row and then F4 to insert it. Now you can see this is page 3 and this is page 4. This is now a report you could print, separate by depot and hand to 4 different people without adding anything manually. What makes these settings so useful is that none of them are difficult once you know where to look. And that's true of Excel generally. The difference between fighting with it and working confidently is often just knowing which tool to use and when. That's exactly what I teach in my Excel Expert course. It brings together the practical features and techniques you need to build cleaner, faster, and more reliable spreadsheets with downloadable practice files and support from me personally. You'll find the link in the description and pinned comment. Here's the third problem, which is the reverse of everything we've just fixed. This time the table is tiny. I'll set the print area, make sure the paper is A4, which it is, and Control P to print preview. And there it is, 5 rows marooned in the corner of an ocean of white paper. There's no point in using any of the default scaling options because it already fits on one page. So let's go into Custom Scaling Options and change the percentage to 150%. It certainly takes up more of the page, but because this table is wider than it is tall, let's change the orientation to landscape. We'll go back into the page setup and see what it looks like at 200%. It still fits, but it might be too big for what you need it for. And there isn't one perfect percentage for every worksheet. It depends on the size and shape of your table, the margins and the printer, etc. But there is a quick way to find the limit without repeatedly testing pages. I'm going to go back in to the page break preview, and here I can change the scale. So let's make it 300%. And now you can see column D is going to be on page 2. So 300% is too big. Let's try 250. And you can see now it fits on one page. Just because Excel lets you make 5 rows enormous doesn't mean you should. A slightly more modest scale with good spacing and a proper heading will usually look more professional than a table inflated to fill every centimetre of the paper. Now, before settling on the final scale, there are a few finishing touches that improve the layout. So let's go into the page setup. We'll change the scale to 200. And on the margins tab, at the bottom, we've got center on page horizontally and vertically. You get a little preview of how it's going to be positioned. And now the summary sits at the center of the sheet. And for a short one-page summary like this, centering it both ways works well. But for a long report that continues over several pages, I'd usually only center it horizontally. Vertical centering could leave the final few rows floating in the middle of an otherwise empty last page. One last trick, and this is the reason to download the practice file rather than simply watch the video. A normal print area, when you set it, is fixed. If you add new rows, I've got some new data here, and I paste it below, and then we go into the page break preview, you can see these new rows will be missing from the printout. To avoid embarrassing mistakes like that, you can set up dynamic print ranges. Remember earlier I mentioned that setting a print area defines a name for the print range. The scope of the name is only for the worksheet, so you can see there's one for each worksheet. This is the current worksheet we're on, and if we look at the refers to, it's referring to cells A1 through to K26. But we can replace this fixed cell range with a formula that returns a cell reference that adapts as our table grows. And we do this with the offset function. Let's go back into the normal spreadsheet view, and I'll delete those extra rows. I'm going to write the formula over here, just so you can see how it evaluates. The first argument is the starting cell in your print range. My table starts in cell A1, and I'm going to press F4 to lock the reference to that cell. The next two arguments tell it how far you want to move down or across from that starting point before starting the range. Well, I don't want to move anywhere before starting the range, so I'm going to skip those two arguments. Next, I need to tell it how high the range is. So I'm going to use count A to count the data in column A and F4 to lock the reference. Now just make sure whatever column you count, there are no empty cells. Otherwise your print range won't be big enough. Close count A. Next, how wide do we want the print range? Well, again, I'm going to count A. This time the column headers, they should always have data in them, so you don't need to worry about empty cells there so much. And then close offset. Now when I press enter, you can see offset has returned my table of data. So I know it's calculating correctly, but I don't want it here, I want it in my name manager. So let's copy the formula and then define a new name. We'll call it print range formula. And then in the refers to, I'm going to delete that and paste in my formula. Now if I go back into the name manager, I need to find my print range name for the current sheet. So we're on the sheet called self-updating area. So it's this one here. And then instead of this hard keyed range, we're going to insert the print range formula and click close. Yes, I want to save the changes. Now I don't need the formula here anymore. Let's delete that. Let's go get the new data and test it out. I'll paste it in. And you can see the grey line has expanded, but let's just check in the page break preview. All of my data is now going to be included. There is one catch. If you later go to the page layout view and manually set a print area, Excel will replace the dynamic formula with the ordinary fixed cell reference. So once you have the self-updating print area working, don't press set print area manually. And now you know how to get any shape data to print just the way you want, but printing's not the only place where Excel settings can create unnecessary work. In this video, I show you 15 Excel settings that make a real difference, including several you'll probably want to change immediately. So click here to watch that next, and I'll see you there.